to our third session on humanities and violence. The speaker for this panel is Professor Federico Finchelstein, who is Associate Professor of History at the New School for Social Research at Eugene Lang College. Professor Finchelstein is the author of 4 books on fascism, the Holocaust, and Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. His last book, Transatlantic Fascism, studies the global connection between Italian and Argentine fascism. And our respondents are Mark Sanders, Professor of Comparative Literature from NYU. Professor Sanders' research interests include African literature, literary theory, law and literature, philosophy and literature, South African literature and intellectual history. He is the author of Complicities, The Intellectual and Apartheid, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, Life Theory, and Ambiguities of Witnessing, Law and Literature in the Time of a Truth Commission. Our second respondent will be Franco Baldasso, who I was very happy to have on a regular basis as my lunchmate and interlocutor. Franco is author of, and I will do this only out of my devotion for Franco, I will pronounce this in Italian. The title of his book is Cerchio di Gesso, Primo Levi, Narratore e Testimone, and he is working currently on his dissertation on the culture and literature of transition from fascism to democracy in post-war Italy.
But first, I would like to thank the organizers, Franco, Mar, and Juan Sebastian, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I always, it's really interesting to be in a conference that discusses the humanities, because my profession, history, is always in between the humanities and the social sciences, and I will explore briefly some of the implications of that. And in a sense, I mean, that is related to, at least from the point of view of history, perhaps when history falters, when it doesn't address its more humanistic dimensions as expressed in narrative concerns, in closeness to the text, and so on and so forth. So I will return to this a little bit later. But I mean, there are many ways in which I was thinking about this, because today I will be talking about violence, and I will be talking about very explicit ideological monsters, to return to some of the language that was used before in the conference. But I mean, there are many ways to address more generally, before I enter the question of fascism and violence, the issue of violence as such, and its relation to the humanities. Because I mean, obviously, one way that generally is related to the concerns of university administrators is the humanities falters when students do not register for our courses. I mean, so that's one way in which this is addressed. I mean, more generally, the humanities might falter from another perspective, which is not mine, when a majority of people do not understand exactly what we do. But these are other, I mean, as I said, these are different possibilities. But I would not like to address this issue from the point of view of one of our hats, which is that of educators, but rather from the point of view of as a researcher. Because, I mean, the relationship between violence, from the point of view of a researcher on, I mean, in my case, working at this intersection between the humanities and the social sciences, which is called history, or that's how I see history anyway. From that perspective, violence can be presented as antithetical to the humanities. So the humanities are faltering when violence prevails. And actually, most of us will agree that at periods of political violence, for example, in the cases of fascism, when intellectuals or humanists were engaged with these ideological regimes, we probably all of us will agree that this was what was famously called by Julien Menda, kind of treason of intellectuals. But that is extremely important, I think, because behind these ideas of betrayal is the idea that how a person that is engaged with the humanities can also be engaged in violence, and more specifically in the case of fascism, in the ideological reification of violence. So I will return to this issue because it's central to my talk, but I wanted to first talk about the relationship between violence and the humanities in that particular dimension. As a matter of fact, now going back to the topic to my topic, which is that of fascist violence and what I see as its most radical outcome, which is the camp and the victimizing process that happened in the concentration camp. I would like to say, before engaging explicitly with that, I would like to say that as you know, in fact, both fascism and the Holocaust were often considered, specifically after 1945, if not before, in the case of fascism, as a kind of example of a crisis in the humanities, the crisis of language, the crisis of our ability to represent. Famously, many intellectuals have said that, and even pessimistically argued that it was impossible to use language to think or to even represent after Auschwitz, as this is well known. But in a way, as researchers, what we want to do, and of course I'm not the only one in this sense, as researchers who study violence, what we want to do is, in a way, constantly displace those limits of representation. So this is something that I'm happy to say most scholars working on violence will agree with. That basically we are not talking about, when we deal with these examples and cases of extreme political violence, we are not talking about a kind of a metaphysical enigma or a kind of not trespassing sign for those engaged in humanities research. As a matter of fact, this is also interesting as the ultimate moment in which the humanities falter. One could talk about the concentration camps as exactly the reduction of any idea of the subject to an object. Again, this is well known, and I would not talk that much about this, but rather I would present how it works in a particular ideological context. So now, if I have to, I would like to start with the topic of my research. In terms of my research as an historian and the relationship between that research and the humanities, another issue that again seems to be very proverbial and even a kind of a cliche, but it's not necessarily done as much in the studies of fascism, is the need to be truly interdisciplinary and to engage the text and the testimonies with some sort of let's say with a closeness that still preserves the critical distance. And again, this is, it sounds again very much of a slogan, but it's very difficult when one is dealing specifically with perpetrators and with fascist texts, because the idea is how one could engage in a sort of sympathetic unsettlement, as Dominic Lacapra has this is an expression that he uses to engage with victims' testimonies. So can we be sympathetic to perpetrators? Of course not. And yet, how can we grasp their the experiential dimension behind their actions? That is to say, in a way, why they are doing what they are doing. And generally, historians of fascism and a big chunk of historians of the Holocaust as well have emphasized the issue of the hows rather than the whys. Because in a way, the hows is much easier to do when one is dealing with perpetrators. You just explain what they did, how they did, and that's enough. Or could be enough. But again, some of us want to know why they did what they did. And again, this is a problem, and almost as a kind of clarification, because I mean, one could engage in a kind of academic populism and say, well, I will allow the sources to speak for myself, even to the extent that I'm almost not there. Well, in my case, that would be fascist propaganda. I mean, if I just let the fascists speak and I'm not there, I mean, that is a very problematic closeness, and that's why, I mean, I always emphasize this idea that I'm an historian of fascism and not a fascist historian. And yet, I mean, this is a problem. I mean, how to stress the centrality of the experience in the case of perpetrators, how to explain that centrality at the same time that one is engaged in the sort of critical distance that is needed for this kind of analysis, not only from a research standpoint, but also from a humanistic, ethico-political perspective, which of course needs to be asserted, particularly in the study of fascism, I think. And in this sense, one possible answer that I propose, as well as with other historians, is to include the experience of the victims. But in my case, it's because I mean, probably you know the work. I mean, the most recent book by Wilfried Lander. I mean, his two-volume history of the Holocaust, in which I mean, among Holocaust and Holocaust historians and historians of fascism, it has acquired a sort of canonic status because he brought back the victims. And as I said, something that it would be more problematic to do with the perpetrators, for the variety of reasons that I was explaining. But some historians, I mean, at least some few historians, specifically the Israeli historian Amos Goldberg, has talked about the problems underlying that narrative, which the victims speak in the context of a kind of melodramatic narrative. And this is this is a problem that he observes when there is this constant stress on the need to understand the victims in a way detached from the experience of perpetrators. And what I'm trying to do is something different, which is somehow connect the experience of the victims with the experience of perpetrators in the sense of how specifically the victims will understand and will experience the ideological violence that is actually objectifying their bodies. And I do this first in the case of Italian and Argentine fascism, and I move throughout the 20th century to reach the concentration camps of the Dirty War. So this is, in a way, what I'm trying to do today is a kind of integration of my work, because a couple of my books are on the 1930s and 1940s and classic fascism, and my most recent book is about this trajectory of what happens to fascism after 45. So I will try to make sense of this as a kind of very symptomatic, I think, engagement with this, and a specific example, which is my example, of how to deal with this issue of violence and the humanities and the challenges that connection engenders. Among historians of fascism, there is a recognition of the centrality of violence. I mean, as a matter of fact, few people will argue that fascism is not at the top ranking of most violence ideologies ever, and in the particular sense of not necessarily in terms of the actions. I mean, because of course, by political violence it has has a very long history, and in modernity, as you know, it traversed, it also encompassed all the isms that were out there, from liberalism to communism and to fascism. But the difference between one big difference between these three isms is that in fascism, violence is not a means but an end, or at least is in a constant state of displacement towards a state of becoming an end, reaching that in certain instances, for example in Auschwitz. That is to say that in fascism, violence is the aim. And why? And this is an interesting question that I asked the sources. I mean, in my analysis of the sources, I mean, I have found different contextual explanations for this. But for many fascists, at least in the case of the Italian fascists and the Argentine fascists, I will of course include the Nazis as well. I mean, it seems to be the case that violence is the ultimate source of power. In the, I mean, again, you know, if you follow a Weberian perspective, this will not be, this will not necessarily be original. I mean, if power is somehow equated with the monopoly of violence, then, I mean, fascism is not that different, let's say, from liberalism. But it is I mean, it is not necessarily through the state, but through the specific actions, violence, that in fascist ideology, in the understanding of fascist ideology, power is created. So there is a different logic. It's not really the suppression of violence through its monopoly, but rather the expression of violence as a source of power. So power is created when violence is unleashed, not monopolized or suppressed. So there is a big difference there. So with this in mind, I mean, one can understand, for example, Hitler's or Mussolini's insistence on the need for a war that in Mussolini's case he knew they were going to lose. I mean, and this is interesting when you follow Mussolini's grapplings with the issue of war, because Hitler thought he had a chance. Mussolini did not. On the other hand, he felt that for ideological reasons one could not escape that war. It is an interesting story. I would like to return to this in the Q&A because I need to reach the dirty war in Argentina in the 1970s, but this is just an example of this issue. Now, I would probably not have time to engage in part of the paper, which is a historiographical discussion of why historians of fascism have downplayed the centrality of the Holocaust and why historians of the Holocaust have downplayed the centrality of fascism for thinking in China. And I just noticed, I mean, returning to the sources, that this relationship, this clear relationship between fascism and the Holocaust has been noted from a variety of sources, and in my analysis and in different parts of my work, I deal with them, from Primo Levi to Jorge Luis Borges, to Chaim Kaplan, to Jana Marie, or even Hannah Arendt. I mean, the idea here is that the violence that was unleashed in the Second World War was related to the ideology of fascism. Now, one of the explanations as to why the Holocaust would not be related to let's say, a more global notion of fascism was this very much 20th century emphasis on national histories. And this is part of, I mean, this is, in a way, this was a starting point of my previous book, because I wanted to understand the transnational connections between fascism. And in that sense, rather than explaining fascism in terms of what I believe it should be, as the generic school of historiography does, I wanted to understand exactly how the fascists understood fascism, how they felt the fascism, what they felt was a kind of elective affinity among fascists worldwide, and which were the differences. And in my case of study, I analyzed the differences and similarities between the Argentine fascists and Italian fascists, to basically sum up that situation in 2 or 3 sentences. They share certain important patterns of a kind of global notion of fascism, beginning with the fact that they believed they were fascists. This is not really a simple point. They were called themselves fascists, and thereby I always feel awkward towards the approach of other historians who feel that they can correct their sources and tell them that no, you are not a fascist. I mean, this kind of distance from the text that is a problem when, particularly when history goes in a kind of let's say forgets its humanities dimension. Let's put it that way. And in that sense, in terms of the affinities, I saw obviously this radical notion of the enemy, a shared anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, and of course the issue of the centrality of violence. I mean, violence as a source of power, violence as the best expression of the self. That is to say that there is the self that is not violent is a degraded self. And to return to the idea of personhood, which was discussed before, I mean, the idea of the fascist self as rooted in authenticity is related to the ability to express oneself through violent means. And then the difference were, I mean, in terms of my analysis, that in Argentina, if the Italian or the German fascists will use the leader. They will obviously have a kind of political theology and an idea of the leader according to which the leader was a godlike figure. In Argentina, the fascists understood that the leader was Jesus Christ, and basically that God, the more traditional God, was the leader of the movement. So that was a very important difference between their secular understanding of fascism and a more, it's not really a secular. I mean, let's say an idea as a political theology more rooted in the persona of the actual leader, let's say a Mussolini or Hitler. Now, after having worked on these issues, I was very interested in the legacies of this violence. But as a matter of fact, also biographically, this is why I started to study this phenomena in the first place. I mean, I can say that I was a child during the last Argentine dictatorship, and when I started my career as an historian in the Argentine universities, I always felt that I wanted to understand exactly what happened there, and this was part of my career. I kind of started earlier. I took the long road because I didn't work on the 70s then. I just decided to study fascism in the 30s, and in my current project I'm kind of coming back to that early project by continuing my research on the legacies of fascism. So what is interesting after 45, I found, is that, I mean, both globally and more specifically in Argentina, fascism is even more than before defined by violence, and specifically by its legacy of violence. Auschwitz, the camps, the deportations, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to explore how people on the extreme right and people that were very close to fascism, if not fascists themselves, before the global defeat of fascism, were engaged with this legacy of violence, and which were the political and practical outcomes of that engagement. And I, for a variety of reasons, I have chosen Argentina as my case study. A, because this is one of my areas of expertise. B, because I found that this was a kind of central location for fascism worldwide, and this is exactly how both fascists and anti-fascists saw it at the time of in the aftermath of the war. I mean, I found an interesting writing, very illuminating writing by Hannah Arendt, for example, where she claims that she talks about the Fascist International, and she refers to South America as the kind of repository for that Fascist International, which, according to her, will no longer be related to a national understanding of the political, but rather a kind of supranational or even transnational understanding of what is to be done in fascist terms. And she was actually very perplexed and very concerned, and she was thinking about Peronism after 45. And this is exactly how someone like Curcio Malaparte would say it. I found that he visited Argentina at the time, and he saw that, I mean, at that point, as you know, he wanted to be as anti-fascist as he could be, so he was actually extremely critical of Perón, because he saw Perón as Mussolini. And in my research, of course, I have found that the story is much more complicated than that. That actually Perón was grappling with this legacy of fascist violence, and in turn, and almost by default, he created a very different political system, which now we are calling populism. So I will return to this, at least in the classic sense of the word. Latin American populism started with Peronism. And I would like to say, just particularly in terms of this legacy of violence, that Peronism is not fascism. So I will return to this and why. But what is interesting is that it's not fascism because this legacy of violence constantly acted as a kind of reminder to Perón that this kind of politics would not prevail in the global, in the early Cold War, and in the global situation that emerged after 45. And yet, again, violence as a definition of fascism was at the center of that. What is interesting is that if fascism was much more complicated, or of course if violence was not its only feature, it would seem to be that after 45, the legacy of violence and the centrality of violence became even more important. Because before it was central to fascist understanding. But it would seem that after 45, for both, well, by then, post-fascists or neo-fascists, I would return to that, or anti-fascists, it was it. That was fascism. So fascism was only this extreme violence that actually classic fascism had unleashed in Europe. So one thing that is interesting to, I mean, then I deal with this in the sense of fascism, fascist violence and the Holocaust as being vectors of memory for a post-fascist world. And there were two countries basically that were quite appealing for fascists worldwide after 45. One, of course, was Franco's Spain, a dictatorship that was in a kind of process of defascistization, and then Peronism. Peron himself had been very sympathetic to fascism. He had even traveled to fascist Italy and Nazi Germany during the war. He presented Italian fascism and also Nazism as socialism with a national character, and there were many ways in which he identified both movements with his own movement. And yet, as opposed to the two most famous examples of fascism, which are the German and the Italian, that basically emerge in a democratic context in order to destroy democracy from within, the Peronism is not really about that. I mean, Peronism emerged from a military dictatorship where Peron was the most important member of man in that regime. Basically, it went from that to an electoral democracy, and this is a huge difference between fascism, which if it doesn't start with dictatorship, it always leads to dictatorship. I mean, this is at the center of the ideology. With Peronism, which is an authoritarian understanding of the political, and yet in an electoral context. I mean, Perón was voted, so he went from being the most important man in the dictatorship to being the elected president of Argentina. And in a way, the history of Peronism is about the constant tension between, let's say, what one might call Perón's fascist mentality or a kind of fascist drive, and the awareness that it was impossible to unleash fascism in a democratic context, in a post-war context, and so on and so forth. So again, how many minutes I have? Because probably I'm okay. How am I? As I said, I want to reach the dirty word. So
yeah, please.
okay. So so basically, what I was interested in raising this issue because, as a matter of fact, it was neither. Overall, Peronism was not anti-Semitic. Of course, it's famous for having received many Nazis, but other countries received Nazis as well. It also received a great deal of Jewish immigration after 45, and you know, beyond the mythical, most Nazis remain in Germany. So a handful of them, some famous ones, arrived to the Argentine shores. But overall, Peronism was not anti-Semitic, and it was not that violent. I mean, there was a lot of violent rhetoric about the enemy and those who were politically opposed to it as traitors to the nation, as people that are allied with imperialism or the aristocracy against the people and so forth and so on and so forth. But it was not really truly violent. As a matter of fact, both the problematic democracies as well as the military dictatorship that came to power in Argentina after 45 were much more violent in terms of people dying because of political violence than classic Peronism itself. So when Perón is toppled by an alliance of anti-fascists, communists and anti-communists, and basically the whole political spectrum that had been important in Argentina before he came to power, a new situation emerges. I mean, regarding the place of violence, because I mean, in my view, Peronism is clearly populism. That is to say, a combination of the combination of the curtailment of certain civic and political rights in an electoral context with, I mean, that combined with enlargement of social rights, social inclusion and so forth. This is one of the contradictions of populism, of course, if you think about populism from a different normative perspective. But in any case, it is not fascism. Fascism was not a working class movement. I mean, in all the cases that we know in Europe, as well as in Latin America, and definitely it did not present the levels of social inclusion that Peronism was able to provide. As a matter of fact, with Peronism in Argentina, what you had is a very effective redistribution of income. That is to say, people that were poor in Argentina were less poor after Perón was gone. So, I mean, this is, I mean, in a way, Peronism is a different monster if you want to return to that metaphor. Vis-a-vis the issue of fascist violence, then Peronism, my argument is that Peronism was not that violent because of that legacy of fascist violence, and that's why I would like to call it a post-fascism rather than a neo-fascism. Because fascism was at the center of Peronist self-understanding, and yet it was not really about the reification of violence. So it's almost a kind of dialectic violence. Fascism acts as a kind of dialectical force towards Peronism. All the time, in a way, ironically, one might say, minimizing, downplaying the potential for violence. So Perón himself will talk many times, define himself as a kind of a lion that prefers to eat vegetables. This kind of thing. This is the paradox of a fascist that would like to be a fascist, but he cannot be because he's a cunning politician. He's smart enough to understand that his followers are not looking for that, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting is that after he goes, he stopped in 1955. This legacy of fascist violence returns to Argentina very clearly, and also very clearly in at least certain right-wing sectors of Peronism. Perón is gone. He visits different Latin American capitals. Eventually, he finds asylum as provided by Franco in Madrid, and in a way, he's in the game, but he's also out of the game. But violence returns, and there are two organizations that I study and I follow for the 60s and 70s, and which are called Tacuara and AAA. I don't know, you might have heard about AAA, perhaps Tacuara is less known. Tacuara, it's a group, I mean, it's a very interesting group of young people. Most of them are men. They are 18, 19, 20, and they understand, I mean, they are coming from the extreme right, I mean, that kind of extreme right fascism that emphasizes the place of Jesus in terms of the political and so on. But they reconnect with Peronism, and they clearly understand, even before people in the left understood this, that in order to be a mass movement in Argentina, you need to enter Peronism. This kind of folkism that then was explored in other Latin American venues was, in my view, first started by these members of the extreme right that entered Peronism in order to provide it with a kind of fascist reformulation. To some extent, they were successful, and I will explain why. Of course, they were not in the majority of the movement, but they occupied important places. So Tacuara unleashes a campaign of anti-Semitism, of practical anti-Semitism. They start putting bombs in synagogues, kidnapping people, killing a couple of Argentine Jewish citizens, and they relate that to both to Peronism and fascism. So in a way, this is a new type of Peronism, because it's a Peronism that is clearly fascist. In that sense, that's why I call it neo-fascist. And central, I mean, basically it would be hard to talk about fascism after 45 for a variety of reasons that I could engage in the Q&A, but I would prefer to call it neo-fascist. And in that neo-fascism, I mean, the legacy of violence is central. That is to say that these violent actions are presented as the road to power, in a very clear fascist sense. In this context, for a variety of reasons, again, in terms of the fascist war, Argentina becomes the center of attention, because, as you know, Adolf Eichmann was living there, and he's brought to justice by the Israelis, and he's kidnapped in Argentina, and he's kidnapping in a way in the kind of paranoid engagement with the political that the neo-fascists had. that kidnapping especially provides them with, in a way, fodder for their kind of for their fascist understanding of the role of Jews in Argentina. So they see Eichmann as an Argentine national. I mean, he had an Argentine citizenship, although he obtained this through false pretenses under a different name. But they basically now they claim that an Argentine had been kidnapped by a foreign power. And I analyzed the centrality of the Eichmann trial in the reconfiguration of what fascism is worldwide. I mean, as you know, this was central in terms of how we historians understand the Holocaust period. I mean, it really changed after the Eichmann trial. Less known is how the extreme right and neo-fascism really changed after the Eichmann trial and how it affected them. In the particular case of Argentina, it affected them as a kind of reinforcement of these ideas of violence and anti-Semitism. At one point, Tacuara implodes. I mean, it's a very interesting history because some members of Tacuara move to the left and they become part of the Peronists and also Trotskyist guerrillas. I mean, so it's a really interesting history how these extremes connect. And how they engage in a political violence under different pretenses and a different ideological apparatus, but also new research on these groups in Argentina is showing the centrality of the idea of the new man and the centrality of the idea of violence as the source of power, in this case in a kind of emancipatory revolution. And yet you see the connections. I mean, or we are starting to see the connections between these different understandings of the political. Now, after that, some of these people remain within fascism, and they continue that. I mean that legacy and that understanding of fascist violence in through an organization that is called the AAA. The AAA is clearly a paramilitarist neo-fascist organization. By this time, Perón returns to power. And the AAA is supplied with weapons and salaries by the new Peronist state. Perón returns to Argentina. At one point, very early on, he passes away, and the army is controlled by actually the leader of the AAA. So you have this Minister of Social Welfare that actually he's the leader of a Peronist paramilitary neo-fascist organization, and they start killing people in numbers that actually are much larger than those of the previous fascist instantiations in Argentina. At one point, in a period of, I don't remember exactly the statistics, but at one point in a period of several weeks, there were more than one people were killed per day. I mean, and these people were identified by them as enemies of the regime, and they included the usual suspects for fascism: psychoanalysts, Argentine Jews, leftists, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens when the military dictatorship comes to power? And I have like probably 4 minutes to explain that. And to me, this is in a way, for me, this is the most important part of this. Is that people from the AAA, in many cases civilians, are given military rank, and they are invited to participate of the repressive apparatus of the dictatorship. The dictatorship establishes a network of concentration camps in the country. People are disappeared. The numbers are from 10,000 to 30,000. I mean, the Nunca Más Human Rights Commission has recorded at least more than 10,000 deaths. People that were, as I said, disappeared. The method, that probably you know this, was first people will be kidnapped, devoid of their subjectivity, their citizenship, their names. They will be put in concentration camps, tortured, and eventually they will be dragged and put into planes, and they will be thrown from these planes to the Atlantic. So they will drown basically when they are dragged and they are still alive. I mean, and they will go, probably they will die when they reach the world. So we don't know exactly how they die. But so this is what we call the desaparecidos. Now, what I do in my work is try to understand the logic of the camps. I mean, what the perpetrators, returning to this idea of engaging with the motivations of perpetrators to do what they do. and my main source are judicial records as well as victims' testimonies for this, how the perpetrators explain what they do to the victims, because they were constantly talking. They were not only torturing people, but they were talking and explaining why they were doing what they were doing. And in terms of, I mean, you can see that in the testimonies that the legacy of fascism and the Holocaust was a source of inspiration for the perpetrators. And this is especially the case for Argentine Jews who were in the camps. People will not be kidnapped because they were Jewish. But then, when they were inside the concentration camp system, their situation as victims will be very different. And this explains the number. Although Jews were less, and are now, less than 1% of the Argentine population, they are among the 10 to 15% of the victims of the dictatorship. And everybody agrees among the victims that there was a kind of special dimension, a kind of, in a way, a surplus, an excess of violence applied to these victims inside the camps, and especially because of this legacy. So all the time, I mean, and then I analyze in the paper, I analyze how the instances of biopower, how the bodies of the victims were turned into somehow repositories of fascist ideology, in the sense that the victims would be told to shout, for example, Heil Hitler. They will be painted Hitler mustache. There will be different kinds of tortures, which I will not mention here, will be applied to them in terms of turning them into, let's say, conflating animals with their bodies, and so on and so forth, turning them into animals, turning them into rats, and so on and so forth, making them behave as different animals. This is very interesting regarding the ideas of personhood and what actually that did not remain in this context. And finally, I mean, I also analyze, and I don't have time for that, the place of jokes. I mean, the particular understanding of jokes for the, I mean, what the perpetrators would find as funny. And all these jokes were related to the concentration camps. So all the time they will be telling victims, we will send you to the gas chambers. Then in the paper I explore the different meanings of these legacies of fascism for victims and perpetrators, because, you know, if, as you know, in a concentration camp, the idea is to provide a kind of reality split for the victim. I mean, this is very consciously so on the part of the perpetrators. There was a kind of ultimate layer to this, in which the victims did not only, were losing their sense of selfhood as well as the sense of their own bodies, but also the sense of time. Because the idea was, I mean, the impossible idea as attempted by perpetrators in Argentina was to turn the concentration camps into a kind of replica of the Holocaust in a post-Holocaust world. So the victims will be told, and I analyze the sense of this, that you are in Auschwitz now, you are you will be sent to the gas chambers, and so on and so forth. So I try to analyze the ideological basis of this. So the Holocaust then, for both victims and perpetrators, was a frame of reference, but a very different one. For the perpetrators, a source of, as I said, ideological inspiration and even emulation, and even, in a way, overcoming, because many times they will be telling the victims, the difference between the Nazis and us is that we will win and they lost. So this kind of, almost a sense of completion of the Holocaust. And for the victim, of course, a totally different thing. Obviously not a source of inspiration, but an ultimate symptom of the debasement of the self, of their own subjectivity. And I see this as one of the central. Perhaps I could finish here because probably I'm past my 5 minutes. I see this as a kind of central dimension of these both transnational and transcontextual situations of fascist violence in the 20th century. So this is one of the cases, I think, that one should engage with. Thank you.
Speak right into the microphone. Am I close enough, or should it be close? well, I'm at the end of my tether. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Federico, for a really enlightening paper. As someone who grew up in apartheid South Africa, I had inklings of the dirty war, some of the leadership in South Africa at that time was inspired by the things that were done in Argentina. And so this fills in some of the details of the politics and the history of the time that I've not really been familiar with in any detail, but certainly had great curiosity about. I think what's so interesting about this, your paper is that in reading Argentinian neo-fascism, your attempt methodologically to find a way of understanding the fascism of that period, dirty war period, avoiding seeing fascism simply as an essence, something which is trans-historical and has features A through F, and if you have 3 or 4 or 5 of those features, it's fascism, otherwise it isn't. And avoiding that on the one hand, and avoiding also the other pitfall of saying, well, this was completely homegrown. So the dirty war in Argentina, an entirely local phenomenon. Apartheid South Africa, an entirely homegrown system. And I really like the way that you avoid these two historiographic and theoretical pitfalls in a way that you see neo-fascism as relational, and relational in a special way because it is you use the word legacy and you use the word memory, but I think what I'd like to underline for the audience today is that this involves an active remembering, perhaps even an invention of memory of what fascism was like in Italy and in Germany during the 1930s and 1940s. And a constitution of a political identity through that active remembering, which then becomes an acting out. I like the example that you give of the camps of the dirty war in Argentina, where prisoners, and particularly Jewish prisoners, were almost required to play a role in a drama which was seen as a reenactment of something which perhaps happened at Auschwitz or another concentration camp in the Second World War. So I think that this is a really, really interesting departure, trying to understand the motivations of the perpetrators through the experiences and through the testimony of the victims, because the victims, I'm not sure if this was clear from Federico's presentation, but in his paper he's really emphasizing how Timmerman and Partnoy and others are remembering the kinds of treatment that they received in the camps during the Dirty War, and this is really the raw material for Federico's argument. But I had 2 or 3 questions. I'm not sure if it's really 2 or 3 that I'd like to pose within the context. But there are a couple of places where I felt I wasn't in complete agreement with either some of your assumptions or the trajectory of the argument. The first is this notion that you begin using on the first page of unrestricted or bare violence, and you use that similar term again on page 7. And I wondered exactly what you meant by that, and what is at stake in using a term bare violence. It seems to evoke bare life, gun ban, and so on. But the violence that you described, this acting out on the basis of an invented memory of the Holocaust and of the concentration camp, seems to be anything but bare violence. It seems like an intensely symbolic violence that is acted out. So certainly not bare. If bare means bare and devoid of a systematic signification. And the other more simple-minded objection would be on page 15. We refer to Operation Condor and the systematic collaboration between Latin American governments of the era. Plan Condor. The killings were not random, we say. So if the killings were not random, they must have been a specific political agenda. So again, that doesn't seem like bare violence to me. So that's the first question. The second, I think maybe this is something that could be opened up more for discussion later on. When you talk about the prisoners in the camps who were asked to play certain roles and to participate in a kind of neo-Holocaust psychodrama by the perpetrators, you say two things which are perhaps raise questions. One is that you're looking at, and you emphasize this in your remarks now, that Jewish prisoners were treated in this specific way. So the question would be, well, one question would be, were non-Jewish prisoners treated in a way which you could say that the violence involved was for them also a reenactment of the Holocaust, or was it restricted to Jewish prisoners alone? Because this, I think, would help us understand the generalizability of your argument. If somehow the non-Jewish prisoner could be interpolated as a Jew, for argument's sake. And the other question, I think the other question is raised, and this is again more of the simple-minded historians or even social scientists question. You give the percentage of Jews who were in these camps, I think 10 or 15%, something of that order. So I'm also wondering whether, in terms of the political, surrounding political motivations, if the 10 or 15% of prisoners who were Jews were arrested, detained, imprisoned, disappeared because they were Jews or because they were political opponents. Because I think the drift of your argument about how memory works and how the legacy of Nazism works is to say that in fact they were there because they were Jews. The simple-minded question is, were they not there because they happened to be political opponents of the regime? So that's the second question. The third question I had is perhaps falls into the trap, perhaps leads me into the trap of positing something generic about fascism. Although I'm phrasing it as a question, aren't you positing something generic about fascism? We'll see, we can discuss this. But you formulate this. I'm going to just look at your text quickly, because you didn't read the text, and perhaps I should just put this before the audience. On 14, you say, paradoxically, Argentina presented a primary case for the return of the repressed memories of fascist violence. In the concentration camps of the last dictatorship, fascist ideology was literalized in the bodies of its victims. Okay, so we have this idea that fascism or neo-fascism is a return of the repressed memories of fascist violence. So this is an interesting idea, and I think is an interesting summation of what you've said about the camps and the way that they're remembered by victims. But it leads me to a rather more speculative question. This is different, I think, from the more simple-minded historian, social scientist questions that I was asking a minute ago. And the question would be this: is the violence that you associate with fascism always analyzable as a return of the repressed, or as a return, as a repetition? So that when you're talking about violence in a fascist context, you need always to be speaking of it as a return or a repetition, that there's no original fascist violence, that it's always somehow mimetic of something that it imagines to have taken place once before. So that's perhaps my falling into a trap of generic characteristics of fascism, which you so very carefully try to avoid. I perhaps am attempting to lead you in the direction that you do not wish to go in, but I was intrigued by that implication. So I'll let you talk.
Well, thank you so much for all this very, very interesting and thought-provoking thoughts about the paper that really opens up, I think, a huge discussion. And well, I would just, I have just a few remarks, and they are about the main tenet of your paper, that is about the legacy of violence that I consider, of course, in very specific settings, and particularly the legacy of violence that was the fascist violence. When I started to approach the whole Euro paper, the first thing that came to my mind is a book that Professor Sanders showed me years ago in our conversations. It's by Mark Rothbard about multi-directional memory, reading sorry, Michael Rothbard, multi-directional memory, reading the Holocaust after in a post-colonial setting, and all the a lot of literature that came on the big issues of course, of post-memory, or what happened after the event, but about this huge and broad topic, I just try to point out some specific issues that maybe could be interesting also for the Q&A. The first one is the relation between not just fascism and the centrality of violence in fascism, but violence in the language and culture of fascism, and how much, for instance, the language and culture were deeply rooted in the previous traditions, and then this language was banned for a fascist or a Nazi aim. I just, thinking about that, also there's a big issue of what to do with this language once fascism and Nazism, or the other kinds of different types of fascism, are not in power. And this is, of course, a problem of representation, but more than a problem of representation, I wanted just to point out, like a fact that since we were speaking about humanities and factuality this morning with Professor Ezra, that really compelled my attention. The fact that when the Balkans were occupied, and I will come back to the Balkans for obvious reasons, is because of the wars that happened just more than 10 years ago there. But when the Balkans were occupied by the fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, the agreement was that a great part of Croatia and Bosnia were under the sphere of influence of Italy, and they started to build up a culture there that was enhanced by the many Dante society that should have taught the new culture of the new, not say race, but the new imperial race that was over that. And instead of, and the Nazi, instead of denying this kind of situation, they instituted Goethe Institute that worked much better than the Dante societies, and that was a good way to, to work out an influence that through what we may consider our great tradition, but it is not just Italian and German, but just European, I would say world tradition. So, and you were speaking about Curcio Malaparte before. I found a very interesting conference of Curcio Malaparte in Croatia just after the takeover by the Ustasha in the Second World War, explaining like why the Italians should be the new big friends and not the Germans. Quoting to the Croatian people, quoting a number of sources from the classical and rhetorical tradition, not just rhetorical, even cultural tradition. So, what to do with a language and a culture that has been so deeply, corrupted by what happened? I'm just thinking about some books that and some authors that try to, of course, not on a popular level, but on a high level, to try to, from intellectual level, try to deal with this problem. The first one is Victor Klemperer, that was a professor, a German Jewish professor that survived, and he wrote this book called Lingua Terza Imperi, about the corruption of his German. And but much more, you can speak about poetry and literature, Paul Celan, Primo Levi, that try. Okay, I won't speak about Paul Celan. There's a very fascinating case of using the language of perpetrators. But Primo Levi, for instance, he chose to use an Italian that was a very particular, because it was a very, very classical Italian, an Italian that was a kind of old-fashioned, and in a way, an Italian that was almost a fascist Italian in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when a number of other writers accused him of being like, out of the century in the way he was writing. And I mean, using the language that he learned in the fascist school, because as an Italian Jew, he was allowed to go to school. Fortunately for him, he was also allowed to finish his degree in the university. But his language, that is the classical Italian, is full of scars, full of contradiction. A language that does not redeem his life, and nothing that happened. It doesn't even try to redeem, but they try to go through the trauma and try to understand it with the very tools of the corrupted language that they had to use. Another case, and now, I have some cases, but another one is very, very interesting, because it's the one of Georges Perec, the French author, that with the novel W, or The Memory of Childhood, in 1975, tried to write his, like a fantastic story of a totalitarian regime in South America that was, I mean, the core principle of this totalitarian regime was sport. So everyone in this country should be, very healthy and go with sport. And together, there's the narrative of the death of both his parents, one particular of his story of him as a child that doesn't know where his mother is, and of course his mother died in Auschwitz. And with that said, these two narratives that are using the language of the perpetrators are interesting, because more and more in the 70s, and this is something what you were saying, you were speaking about in the paper, there is a very interesting sentence that not only Argentina from Hannah Arendt was seen as South America as a potential site for fascist resurrection, and of course the transition from post-fascism, the Peronism, to neo-fascism was a sort of ideological laboratory. But also, I was thinking about the fact that a number of European writers in the 70s, some of them that had, where, I mean, like in Mercatage, for instance, they were in Auschwitz, so wrote like some particular book. The first one is the one by Georges Perec, Mercatage Detective Stories, in 1977. I can think about of other Italian writers like Carlo Gadda and Leonardo Sciascia. They wrote some books about fascist violence, and the setting was South America. So it's interesting the fact that there was this double bind between South America perceived like the possible reconstruction of fascism, or maybe the place where fascism could have an afterlife, and the anti-fascists, if I can call it so, intelligentsia of Europe that were not being able to address directly some problems at home, and they changed the setting of their problems, writing books about South America. Some of them have never been there, for instance. So this is just one big point, and maybe it goes towards your, in a maybe weird way, it goes towards the idea of a multi-directional memory that works at different levels. Another point that I wanted to emphasize is not that far from what Professor Sands already said. That was the one of aesthetization of violence and of the Holocaust, and at this point also of a staging of violence. And in a way, I mean, starting from a less historiographical, but maybe more literary or cultural based point of view, I'm thinking about of all the artistic pretensions of a number of intellectual trends in the early 20th century and also in the second part of the 20th century. They wanted to substitute art to life. And of course, this is not an origin of the violence of fascism, but of course it's a big tenet of the fact that with this idea of willing to substitute art to life, it's also a way to froze life to a certain category. I'm quoting here, and not giving other possibilities of life that is at the core of what fascism did, basically. And I'm putting here a literary critic, Leo Barsani, who wrote an interesting book called The Culture of Redemption, in which he argues not that this is a step toward fascism, but that the culture of redemption, a culture where the culture itself, art, substitutes itself for a clear conception of life, is destined to deal with problems that are way bigger than culture, than literature itself. And I wonder whether this humanist take is part of a general idea of violence as a spectacle, as a staging, as an aesthetization, which also makes me think again about the Balkan occupation in the Second World War, where there are, I mean, knowing that the Nazis were violent and they were very tough guys, at the very end of their imperium, the fascists occupying Slovenia and Croatia, they started being more violent than the Nazis. I mean, according to historians like David Rodoni and so on and so forth. Yeah, just 1 minute. And so I wonder whether this, and this goes back to the idea of what happened in Argentina. I wonder whether there is a sort of the Nazis represented not just the locus of all evil, but sort of like a model for the possibility of violence that have been repeated again and again. I mean, after Second World War, a writer like Czesław Miłosz wrote about the eastern countries as a big sickness of the country in the eastern part of Europe, because they're sick of historical imagination, that they are not able to see life, history, if not in the frame of a precedent, an antecedent past that was, of course, a past of violence. And I just would like to conclude here, maybe with just a couple of remarks, thinking about Slobodan Milosevic, that aroused Serbian masses against Kosovo, even before the starting of the war, even before the Yugoslavia collapsed in 1989, while you know, in front of masses quoting the poems speaking of the great battle of 1389, where the Serbians were defeated by the Turks, and using this sort of narrative that for us it looks like crazy to think about, yeah, but what does to do with the 20th century? But this was used like a sort of chivalric romance to arouse mass violence and to arouse like a nationalistic idea, nationalistic input. There was, again, another iteration of history. So, and then, again, an iteration of violence. So, well, I have a lot of other remarks, but I think that there's a problem of this iteration, maybe, and this problem of the historical thinking, or historical imagination can maybe be part of a broader understanding of why also they had to repeat the trope of the perpetrator and the victim in the same words and with the same reference in the Dirty War that were already in the Holocaust.
Yes. Well, more than a moment. This, thank you so much. I mean, this is a lot to think about, and it's definitely going into my current work. And this is not. I mean, even in my presentation, I try to convey. Definitely not to convey. I mean, the opposite of a sense of closure, right? Because I'm working on this and exploring these issues. And Professor Sanders, in terms of, I mean, to me, it's really interesting. I mean, what you suggested about South Africa, I mean, that is something that I would like to perhaps talk later in a different occasion about this, because to me, I mean, the kind of global dimensions of this, I don't know much about South Africa, I know more about Central America, and the global dimensions of this model, I mean, were a source of inspiration. And then what is interesting is that, I mean, this is not my project, but actually just to know that, I mean, after, I mean, when the truth commission was created in Argentina, I mean, it also became a kind of an experience that it was, well, for example, in South Africa, totally reformative, because there it became actually the model for larger truth commissions. I mean, in Argentina we had a truth commission, and in South Africa it became a truth and reconciliation commission. And even that went back to Latin America, and in many countries you don't have a truth commission, but rather also a truth and reconciliation commission. Because in Argentina the truth commission was actually created by the government to provide a report that was used as evidence for the trials of the junta, but there was no attempt at reconciliation. And I mean, the long history of the 20 years that went between that and well, the 30 years that, sorry, the 20 years that went without, between that and the present are also very, very interesting, more than 20 years actually. So that is really fascinating. I mean, all these convergences and also affinities. Where to begin? In terms of, well, I will not repeat your comments, which I take as truly inspiring, I have to say. I mean, particularly the way that you put into words what I'm trying to do, which I will appropriate with your permission. But going back to, I mean, now entering your questions, the first point, actually, you are very convincing, and I was coming from a different debate, which which is this stress on structural violence, on everyday violence that goes against, methodologically goes against the possibility of understanding the turning points in history, the particular agency of perpetrators in particular context. That's let's say, in the background of the debate, and yet because of that, and as you suggest, I'm not pointing out or even highlighting, as I should, the extent into which this acting out, this recreation, restaging, is extremely symbolic. I mean, what is interesting is that it's at the same point that is symbolic, that in a way, I mean, I guess, I mean, what I'm trying to do is to show, I mean, that is, that against this too much emphasis on structural violence, what goes on in the ground is this combination of the symbolic and the explicit. I mean, because as a matter of fact, although I use bare violence, which perhaps I'm definitely discussing with Agamben, with this sense of now the Holocaust is everywhere, and basically the emphasis on everyday violence, which is extremely important, but doesn't allow us to see these particular ruptures in history and how they were extremely influential in providing very explicit cases of political violence rather than the more prevalent and in a way less visible structural violence. So what you are helping me to see here is how the symbolic and the explicit are combined. So in a way, this antithesis or this dichotomy is obviously in our conceptual apparatuses. But coming from the discussion, I was emphasizing the explicit, and you are totally right that I'm trying at different points. I'm suggesting that, so I need to put this explicitly because otherwise it will seem a contradiction when I don't see a contradiction. Actually, the point is that yes, this is a combination of explicit and symbolic violence. So you are totally right. So I accept the criticism, and this goes straight to my work as a correction. Then the issue of well, the question about this is interesting, and you know, in the last chapter of Mark forthcoming book, I mean, which here there is a small section of that. I mean, I explore these dimensions in terms of the victimization of other victims through this prism of fascism and even the Holocaust. But it seems to be the case, I mean, in terms of the different testimonies, that Jewish and non-Jewish victims agree that there was a special dimension that was not necessarily touched in the torture and extermination of non-Jewish victims. I mean, the fascist discourse, yes. I mean, it was a typical procedure. I mean, and again, because my point is that in Argentina, 2 minutes, okay. My point is in Argentina, can we negotiate and have 3? I don't even, at this point, I cannot recognize the difference between 2 and 3 in terms of how I talk, but if you guarantee 1, we have more time. So there is, I mean, this becomes part of the folklore. Look, they were also, I mean, because many people know about this, particularly people working on these topics, but it's not explained, and it's kind of accepted as the folklore of the camps. That, for example, in different torture sessions for Jewish and non-Jewish victims, they would play LPs or recordings, recordings of speeches by Hitler or Mussolini while they are torturing people. For example, provide electroshocks, and in this kind of splitting of time, the victims are listening to Hitler while they are being tortured by Argentine perpetrators. So I mean, and I don't think this is only a ritual. And if it is a ritual, I actually argue that it is a ritual that it has an ideological roots rather than a kind of folkloric, romantic view of Nazism, which itself is an ideological text. So that's my. And yet there are important distinctions. I mean, that you are right that. I mean, for example, Timmerman, who insists. I mean, and some people disagree with his insistence. Obviously, Timmerman, at least in the US, the most famous case of a victim of the dictatorship, he claims that he was there because he was Jewish, and Judaism as a topic occupied the majority of the quote-unquote conversations that he had, I mean the interrogation, because they were torturing him and they were asking him to confess that he was the leader of a Jewish conspiracy. Actually, that he was an elder of Zion. This is one of the issues there. And yet, the majority of, I mean, I will not engage in this issue of whether he's right or not, this is his perception, but I would argue that the majority, if not all of the victims, they were not kidnapped because they were Jewish. They were kidnapped because they were seen as enemies of the dictatorship. I mean, which could involve actual political opposition to many other things. I mean, being a psychoanalyst, for example, very suspicious, and so on and so forth. So this is an issue, but certainly there are important differences. I probably don't even have any longer. I mean, no. So I might have to then, discuss this afterwards. But thank you for the points.
Well, there will be a reception right after our keynote, so then we can definitely discuss. Thank you.
Okay.